I survived 600 days with the Create mod in hardcore Minecraft, and in this episode, I set the goal of building my biggest project yet, a massive automated crafting room for every Create block. Will I be able to do it? Stay tuned to find out. To start out, I actually had to find a good spot for the massive auto crafting room that I was planning on building, so I looked around for a little bit and eventually decided on the area below the lava generator. I dug a tunnel down into the deep slate, and after making it 3 wide, I took a couple steps back just to kind of take a look at it overall. It definitely seemed a little bit out of place for now, but I did have a cool plan to fix that. It was just going to be a little bit until I actually got there. With the entrance good to go, I started digging out the underground room, which ended up being pretty time consuming since the room itself needed to be decently big for the build I was planning. The digging continued into the next day with me making a few trips back and forth to the ore processing setup and storage room just to kind of drop off random items, clogging up my inventory and appropriately sort everything. Since my pickaxe was nearly dead, to nobody's surprise, I did some trading with the Fletcher and managed to get it back into, let's just be nice and call it slightly usable condition. This was yet another problem future Rage would have to solve, and spoiler alert, I actually do solve it in this video, so let's hold off on any of the sassy comments about my pickaxe durability just for a little bit. After 3 days of mining, I finally managed to clear out what I thought at the time to be a suitable amount of space for the build, so I went back to the storage room to grab some supplies for planning everything out. I made some signs to label different areas and then browsed the Create items and bookmarked the ones that I frequently crafted. After bookmarking about 10 items, I grabbed some polished granite and used it to map out different sections of the room. It took a bit of planning and slightly more digging, but by the end of the day, I had my extremely rough outline done. With the areas of the room mapped out, I started going around with signs and labeling what I wanted in each section. I made the center section on the far wall for just a generic storage display that I thought would end up being pretty cool, and then I labeled the remaining 10 sections with the various 10 Create blocks that I bookmarked earlier. I didn't really plan for it, but the numbers actually worked out perfectly with the amount of sections I had and the exact amount of blocks that I bookmarked. And while it wasn't every block in Create, I'd say that the 10 blocks that I bookmarked covered about 75% or more of my generic day-to-day crafting. Once every section was labeled, I started collecting blocks to build the assembly lines, but I did get momentarily distracted by my nearly broken sandpaper, since apparently I have an issue with everything's durability, and went to do some trading to fix it. To finish getting everything I needed to work on the assembly lines, I had to do a little bit of crafting. I made some rose quartz and used my newly repaired sandpaper to turn it into polished rose quartz. I turned nearly all of that into electron tubes and then crafted up some crafting tables, along with turning a bunch of wood into brass casing before collecting it with my wrench. I used all of these items to craft a ton of mechanical crafters and went back to the room to make my first assembly line, which would be for cogwheels. I got rid of the polished granite and placed down a 5-long belt to carry the shafts with 2 chests on top, one for input and one for output. I placed the deployer in the middle of the belt to use planks on the shafts and actually craft the cogwheels. With the deployer now placed down, I had to supply it with planks, so I placed a second input chest over the first one and put a small belt directly behind it to connect to the deployer. The rough outline of the cogwheel assembly line seemed good enough to me, so I just moved on to the large cogwheel assembly next. This assembly was essentially identical to the cogwheel assembly, just using slightly different items, so I quite literally duplicated the exact build that I had just made. The brass funnel assembly came right after that and was the first assembly to actually make use of the mechanical crafters. I put down a 3x1 of mechanical crafters that would output the brass funnels into a chest, and then I put down an input chest on the other side of the designated area. I spent a while thinking of the best way to handle multiple items being put into the same input chest, and eventually I just dug back into the wall to place a belt behind the input chest to carry items out of it. Much like with the cogwheels, the brass tunnel setup was identical to the brass funnel setup, just with a slightly fatter mechanical crafter setup, so I duplicated it and just kind of left it at that. At this point, I realized the mechanical crafter setups were a lot more complicated to fully automate, so for the remaining ones, I simply put down the input and output chests and a general outline of what the final mechanical crafter step in the entire thing would be. After roughly mapping out each assembly line and realizing the massive scope of the project, and I mean way bigger than I even initially planned, I started crafting up a lot more blocks. I pressed a bunch of sheets, made a ton of brass casing, crafted a few precision mechanisms to turn into mechanical arms, and made tons and tons of brass funnels. Ironically, this would have been a little bit easier if the setup I was working on was done to help me make the setup I was working on. And if that confuses you, that's fine, because it confuses me too, but if you don't think about it too much, it actually makes sense. With my inventory full of new blocks to expand on the assembly lines, I mentally prepared for the work ahead of me and went right back into the assembly room. I started out with a cogwheel assembly line yet again and replaced the chest with barrels, really just for looks, and then put down funnels on each input barrel. Realizing I was lazy and wanted to input andesite alloy instead of shafts that I'd have to craft myself, I went and crafted some mechanical saws and hoppers to use in the assembly line. I removed the belt line and placed down a mechanical saw and a hopper with a slightly shorter belt line after it to turn the andesite alloy into shafts before then turning it into cogwheels. I put a funnel on the output barrel and set the filter for the mechanical saw to shafts, and yes, I know, I did forget to put a funnel on the deployer. For the large cogwheel line, I simply had to replace the chest with barrels and place down funnels on quite literally everything, and it was good to go since I'd be inputting cogwheels from the prior assembly and didn't really have to worry about all that mechanical saw crap. Unfortunately, with both cogwheels out of the way, it was time to deal with the much harder setups that I was kind of hoping to put off for a bit longer, so I went back to the brass funnel assembly line and put down funnels into each crafter to filter what the mechanical arm would eventually place in each one. Since I wanted to do as little crafting as possible, I slapped down a depot and put a 2x1 mechanical crafter setup outputting onto it for the electron tubes. I swapped out the input chest for a barrel, put a funnel on it, and placed down depots next to the barrel and the belt line. I put funnels into each depot and into the new mechanical crafters before tearing nearly everything down, clearing out a bigger space, and rebuilding the same exact thing. To make it even more complicated, I placed down a mechanical press over one depot to make iron sheets, and a deployer with enchanted sandpaper over another depot to make polished rose quartz. I set filters for a bunch of the funnels and made some small tweaks before placing down a mechanical arm that would control the entire assembly line. Since brass tunnels are so similar to brass funnels, I also made the same upgrades to the brass funnel assembly. The room had to be a little bit more congested again because of the fat final mechanical crafter setup, but for the most part, everything was the same, including the overly complicated press and deployer setup to save myself from doing really any minimal amount of crafting that I possibly could. Once everything was in place, I put down the mechanical arm and went to do some trading before crafting and enchanting yet another piece of sandpaper to put in the new deployer I had just placed. Mechanical drills were next on the list, so I tore down the mechanical crafters, dug back into the wall, and replaced both chests with barrels. I messed around with a few different placements for the final mechanical crafters and placed down a belt behind the input barrel along with depots next to it and the barrel. I settled with the mechanical crafters being on the back wall mostly for looks, and then used a depot for the output with a funnel into the output chest. I dug behind the crafters to put funnels down there as well, and finally placed down the mechanical arm for the entire assembly line. Surprisingly, I wasn't done yet and had to go grab some additional blocks from around the base before coming back and properly setting all the brass funnel filters so the mechanical arm would actually be able to function properly and do its job. With half the assembly lines now slightly more polished, it was time to finish the remaining ones, which was essentially the same process as the first 5 I worked on, so I'll boil it down for you. All the chests became barrels, with the input barrels having varying length belts coming out of the back to put items onto depots. Those depots would then process the items if it was even needed with presses or deployers or whatever else it might be, and then the mechanical arm would move the items from mechanical crafter to mechanical crafter until the recipe was done. While each setup kinda had some intricacies to it based off the actual crafting recipes, roughly 80% or more of each was the same, and I had to spend a long time working on all of them. With the setups finally done, or so I thought at least, it was time to start thinking about powering them. I figured windmills would actually be a pretty cool upgrade to the room visually, and also give sufficient power, so I started gathering and crafting everything I'd need for one massive windmill. Making the bearing itself was obviously super easy, and I still had some sails laying around from prior builds with plenty of linear chassis, but it seemed like I was going to need a lot more sails if I wanted to power everything. I got slightly confused by the new sail recipe since I had no clue it actually changed, but after getting stun locked on it for about a minute, I went and grabbed all the crafting materials other than wool, which I needed a lot more of. Before dealing with my wool problem, I did even more trading with the Fletcher to further repair my pickaxe, and I finally got it to about 50% durability. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that that is the biggest win of the video so far. And clearly, if you're not aware of the meme, my pickaxe is always broken. Bright and early the next day, I went to the surface to shear my sheep and hopefully make tons of sails to power my fancy assembly lines. I'm gonna be honest, I really wish I could tell you guys that this day was anything other than shearing sheep, but I wanted to make sure I had plenty of wool for the build and any future ones, so it meant chilling with my buddies on the surface for majority of the day. This entire process was definitely eye-opening though, since it made me heavily consider expanding the pen and breeding a ton more sheep so I'd be able to get more than like 1 wool a minute or whatever it currently was. With my newly acquired stash of wool, I crafted 2 stacks of sails, assuming that that would be plenty for the build, and went to the assembly room to do a bit more planning. I put down the windmill bearing in the center of the ceiling and checked which direction it defaulted to spinning before building out the sails on each side just to see how the design looked visually. The design itself didn't look too bad, but I spent some extra time messing around with the size of the sails before I just tore it down to continue building. I didn't really want the windmill to be too in my face or anything in the room, or for it to feel cramped, so I started digging the ceiling up higher, but left a little bit of the lip on the outside so it didn't just turn the room into an even bigger box. After clearing out 1 layer on the ceiling, I stepped back and made the executive decision to clear out 1 more layer, and that should ideally be sufficient. It definitely took a while to clear it all out, and I could almost feel my actual neck hurting from staring up at the ceiling in game for so long, but once it was done, I was thrilled and finished out the day by just sorting some items and doing some trading to make up for all the mining that I just put my pickaxe through. Clearly, the pickaxe is the real MVP of the series, because this thing has been through so much and just can't seem to catch a break. Since my brain was a bit burned out after working on the assembly lines for so long, I decided it was a good time to take a break and maybe try and decorate the room a bit. I grabbed tons of building blocks and started planning out the first corner of the room. I really wanted to highlight each specific assembly line, so I outlined them in spruce wood and then tried out some variations of andesite and deep slate blocks as fillers. Eventually, I settled on a deep slate backdrop with andesite flooring. After finishing the initial corner, I took the same design and basically just replicated it for each assembly line around the room. While I was doing this, I added in some additional detail in the corners in between each assembly line just to help separate them even more. At this point, I felt like the room was really coming together nicely, but lacked the depth that I had been discussing with the ceiling design, so I added in slabs around each section of polished andesite to frame the assemblies and give the floor an additional layer. I spent an extremely long amount of time trying to decide which variation of cobbled deep slate looked the best for the central flooring of the room. I had to pick between polished deep slate bricks, or deep slate tiles, and don't be fooled. Even though they may look very similar, if I learned anything from HGTV, this was a critical decision that would basically make or break the room. I eventually decided on the tiles and filled in the entire area with them. Since I was on a bit of a building spree, I just figured I'd finish off as much as I could, so I went ahead and replaced all the walling in the assembly rooms with deep slate bricks and replaced the ceilings with polished andesite. To finish things off, I added in some additional detail to the entrance and made the small, but in my opinion very tasteful change of replacing the outer polished andesite blocks with polished andesite stairs for the flooring. At this point, the only gross thing left to beautify in the room was the ceiling, so I took some time to try to decide yet again between different variations of deep slate blocks for the outer lining. I really struggled between using tiles or bricks and using whole blocks or stairs. Eventually, I picked the deep slate bricks as they were just slightly less harsh, I guess, compared to the tiles, and then I made a cool pattern using both stairs and blocks that helped frame the pillars and give depth to the ceiling. To finish off the last layer of the ceiling, I initially tried using polished andesite to match the flooring, but realized it really just looked out of place, so I ditched it pretty quickly. I ran over to the storage room and just snagged some cobbled deep slate and was actually pretty happy with how the plain version looked, along with all the different block variants in the room. Once the ceiling was completely filled in, I did my typical move that you can probably guess and grabbed some moss blocks to make patches in the ceiling just for some additional color. On top of that, I took a suggestion from one of you and grabbed some regular deep slate and put that in the ceiling as well, just to give even more texture and color that didn't look too out of place. Once everything was done, I was thrilled with how the ceiling turned out, but there was still a lot more detail to add, so I sorted out my inventory a bit and grabbed some additional blocks like chains, crafting tables, and trapdoors. While I had a fair bit of the blocks I wanted to use for additional detail in the room, I was missing a few, so I went to the surface to collect some oak leaves and get a little bit more leather. I had to travel to find some oak trees, but I knew where they were from when I went to get beehives, so I just kinda ran straight in that direction and eventually found them. While I was collecting leaves, I really just killed any animal I saw, even if it wouldn't give me leather, but I will say I was especially excited when I got to kill cows. I end up using leather so much in this video that I really should have brought home some to breed, but apparently I'd rather just kill animals in the moment for like the thrill of the hunt or something. I'm not really sure what that says about me, but I'm just gonna pretend it's because I'm too lazy to bring them home, and we'll leave it at that. Once I had collected plenty of leaves and nearly a stack of leather, I returned to the base to do even more building. I used all the leather I just collected to make a bunch of item frames and placed one down over each assembly area to show what was being produced in that specific assembly line. I took the stack of oak leaves I gathered and randomly placed down bunches of them in the back of the assembly rooms and coming down from the moss patches in the ceiling. Since the mechanical arms can work through blocks and I never really go into the assembly rooms, I had tons of freedom to kind of make them look overgrown and do whatever I wanted with them, and I loved it. I tossed lanterns down randomly on the pillars around the room and exchanged some of the stripped blocks between the assembly areas for crafting tables. I even put down pots with different colored flowers in them just to brighten up the room even more. To finish everything off, I grew some glowberries from the ceiling, and again, I took a suggestion from you all and I snipped the bottom with shears so they wouldn't grow any longer. Quite honestly, I didn't even know that was a thing until you guys told me about it, but it is so nice. With everything done, I stepped back and I absolutely loved how the room turned out. I still believe this room is my crowning achievement, both in terms of functionality and in terms of looks for this entire series so far. With all the assembly lines done and the decorating now finished, I had to worry about powering everything, so I started digging into the floor in front of the cogwheel assemblies to make a small vertical windmill instead of one big one. I wanted to be able to see the windmill to give the room a little bit of life, so I made some cool create glass, but it turns out it only became seamless vertically, which kinda sucked, so I went with framed glass instead. I dug the hole a bit deeper so I could actually fit a small windmill in it, and made the walls out of spruce wood and polished andesite to match the rest of the room. I slapped down a windmill bearing in the center of the floor and built up with linear chassis to eventually hold all the sails. I'll admit, I struggled to put down all the sails in such a cramped space and even had to lower the floor a bit, but eventually I did manage to finish it, but it looked I don't know how else to say it, it just kinda looked. To fix the issue of the mundaneness, let's say, of the windmills, I figured out I could dye the sail blocks a nice green color to match the room even more. Unfortunately, I didn't have much green dye on hand, and I checked all the possible recipes for it and settled on just going to the surface to gather lots and lots of ferns. Thankfully, there were tons of ferns right outside the elevator, so I got to go on a nice shearing spree without really having to travel too far from home. As the sun set, I made my way back to the elevator with way more ferns than I would ever need. And I mean that quite literally. I didn't need any of these. Once I got back down into the base, I tossed all the ferns into the ore processing setup to be crushed down into green dye, and then I just sat at the output to pick up each piece because I was way too lazy to adjust all the filters. With a stack and a half of green dye in hand, I went to test it out on the windmill, and it looked awful. I mean, it looked so bad, guys. And on top of that, it didn't even consume the green dye too. So not only did it look horrible, but I wasted an entire day going to the surface for ferns when I could have just used one of the 10 that I already had. In an absolute last-ditch effort to save my beautiful room from the disgustingness of the windmills, I made some lime dye, and after testing it, it looked amazing on the windmill. I also realized that once the windmill was moving, I could place moss carpets and lanterns and stuff inside the area, so I did a little bit of extra decorating there as well. Over the next 2 days, I replicated the exact same windmill setup for every single platform in the assembly room. My plan was for each windmill to power the assembly line directly next to it, rather than having one big windmill to power the entire room. I don't necessarily think one option is better or worse than the other, but I do think this one looked a lot cooler, so it's what I ended up going with. After all the building was done, I was finally able to clean out my inventory and get rid of the chest of building blocks that had just been sitting in the center of the assembly room. Once all of the cleaning chores were taken care of, I made tons of andesite casing and crafted up all different kinds of rotational transportation blocks like gearboxes, cogwheels, encased chain drives, and even 6 rotation speed controllers, so I would have one for each windmill. I was definitely pretty worried about how spaghetti-esque the setup would be for powering these, so I started out with the cogwheel assemblies as I thought they would probably be the easiest. I ran the rotational power from the windmill back towards the wall and hooked it up to the rotation speed controller before bringing it up to the back of the large cogwheel setup. I had to fiddle with some gearboxes and additional shafts to get everything spinning in the correct direction, but as I suspected, it wasn't too bad because there weren't really that many moving parts. With the large cogwheels done, it was time to move on to the regular cogwheels, so I just dug a tunnel and moved the rotational power from the rotation speed controller over to the cogwheel assembly line. Much like before, I used a mess of gearboxes and shafts to get the rotational power spinning properly for each belt system and the deployer. All things considered, this one was also very easy. I tunneled my way out and used some andesite casing to cover up some of the visible shafts, but I quickly realized I forgot to actually power the mechanical saw. I tried using encased chain drives, but they set it in the wrong direction, so instead I just used 2 cogwheels and it was good to go. To finish off the rotational power setup, I went back down to the rotation speed controller and just cranked it up as high as it would go without overstressing the system, which admittedly wasn't super fast, but I figured it should be sufficient for bulk crafting. With both systems now up and running, I snagged some andesite alloy from the mixing setup and some wood from the storage room and loaded up the cogwheel assembly line for its first test run. It worked flawlessly and was so satisfying to watch after spending so long setting this entire thing up. After it finished making 8 stacks of cogwheels, I took some and loaded them into the large cogwheel assembly line for yet another test run. By the end of the day, both assembly lines had passed their test run with flying colors, looked amazing, and my brain was absolutely fried. To give my brain some time to cool off, I did some trading with the Fletcher and made more andesite casing. I snagged some of the freshly made cogwheels and crafted up a bunch of extra gearboxes before starting in on the brass funnel assembly. Similar to what I did before, I dug down and ran the windmill power to a rotation speed controller and then up to the assembly room. It was definitely a bit more congested, but I was able to use a gearbox to give power to the press and deployer, and then cogwheels to power the mechanical arm. I ran power from the main line over to the belt using encased chain drives, and used a very strange mess of cogwheels and gearboxes above the ceiling to power both the mechanical crafters. With everything connected, I covered stuff in andesite casing, cranked up the rotation speed controller, and took it for a test drive. Unfortunately, during the test, I realized I forgot I needed brass somehow, which is amazing because it's in the name, and I had to spend ages moving the entire room back 1 to add in a depot for the brass. Once it was all fixed and up and running again, the assembly line worked perfectly. I noted the deployer with the enchanted sandpaper likely wasn't a very efficient solution and would end up being a problem, but that would be a simple fix for later. After finishing the brass funnel assembly, it was time to move on to the brass tunnel one, which suffered from the same exact lack of brass depot issue, so I got ahead of it this time and moved the room back 1 before hooking up all the rotational power. The rotational power hookup was quite literally identical to the brass funnel one, so I'll spare you the details, but just imagine a fine Italian chef making the perfect spaghetti. And yes, that reference is actually quite accurate because I'm both part Italian and I make spaghetti. It also means it's not offensive for me to say, "It's a spaghetti!" And no, you're not allowed to judge that, even if it was extremely stupid, because yeah. I had to fiddle with the mechanical arm once everything was hooked up, but after placing it back down, the brass tunnel trial run went super well. I also checked back in to see the brass funnel assembly was still working, and it felt so nice to just sit back and watch both lines working simultaneously. Over the next 5 days, I repeated the same process for the drills, press, and deployer assembly lines. Much like all the other assembly lines I'd done so far, it was mostly just a lot of messy behind the scenes rotational power that I would ultimately cover up to look nice and functional and just pretend wasn't even there. I did trial runs for each assembly line to make sure there wasn't another brass incident, and thankfully, everything seemed to go off without a hitch. Granted, they weren't the fastest assembly lines ever, but that could be fixed later with bigger windmills. Having just completed tons and tons of rotational power routing, I wanted a quick break, so I went to the storage room and sorted out the mess that was my inventory. I ditched some junk blocks, crafted some hoppers, and made my way back to the assembly room to use the hoppers in place of the belt lines. In hindsight, the belt lines really weren't a great solution because I could only put one stack of each item in the chest at most, or I'd risk the entire line getting backed up. Instead, I chose to use hoppers and barrels for each depot, meaning I had to go around to every assembly line room that had a belt system and replace it. It was pretty basic work for most of the rooms, but there were a few that needed a new depot since they hadn't used belts and instead just had 2 brass funnels off of the single input barrel. Once the new depot was down, I did have to reconnect the mechanical arms since it would have to have new inputs, and that was a bit annoying to have to do. Having fixed the backup issue with the new barrel and hopper combo, I spent the next 2 days finishing hooking up the rotational power to the remaining assembly lines in the room. At this point, I was basically a pro at connecting everything because most followed the same basic setup, and I had now been doing this over and over and over again for hours. My brain was effectively melting, but I hope you guys at least enjoy it. With all the technical stuff out of the way, I went and grabbed a bunch of the create blocks that I'd be auto-crafting from my chest, and then crafted up a few more item frames to use in the assembly room. Before heading back to the room to do even more decorating, I did remember the placard block Create recently introduced, so I crafted one of those just to compare with the item frames. I tested out both the placard and item frame on the cogwheel setup since I wanted something to indicate what went in each barrel, both for practical purpose and just for aesthetic reasons, and the placard just looked so much better. So I converted all the item frames to them and started slapping down placards on every single barrel. I didn't have every item I would need, but I filled in as many as I could, and I was thrilled with how it looked after finishing off both cogwheel assemblies. Sadly, not everything can go perfectly, and the minute I tried to do the same thing for the brass funnels, I found a bug. The placard can apparently accept every single block except the funnel, which meant for the time being, I'd have to leave it blank. I also used this as a chance to quickly get rid of the deployer and sandpaper setup. I finished off the rest of the assembly rooms with little to no issue, other than having to occasionally go craft the specific block I needed to fill in the placard, or just go craft more placards in general. While I was finishing up with the placards, I had noticed the encased fan setup didn't actually have all the components it needed for crafting, so I expanded the room back by one and put it in a new depot that would eventually be for shafts. I reassembled the mechanical crafters, switched the depot out for a mechanical saw and depot combo that would actually craft the shafts from andesite alloy, and reconnected the rotational power to everything. Once everything was properly spinning and the crisis had been averted, I slapped down brass funnels on the newly placed mechanical crafters, set their filters, and reset the mechanical arms inputs and outputs. The next 2 days were crafting days since the assembly room was essentially complete, and I needed to do final test runs on every assembly line to make sure there were no new issues that had popped up or any that I just somehow managed to overlook. I collected tons of material including iron and brass ingots, andesite alloy, and plenty of newly made andesite casing. I actually needed so much andesite and andesite casing that I had to sit for a while and wait for the mixing setup to make over 10 stacks of andesite alloy. Since the earlier andesite casing wouldn't end up being sufficient, I made an additional 3 stacks of andesite casing, which was a huge pain, but I'll admit it was extremely satisfying to collect with the wrench once it was all done. I finished off the preparations by making a stack of polished rose quartz and was ready to load up the entire room. The time had finally come to fill up each assembly line in hopes of everything working. So I started out at the cogwheels and worked my way around the room, dumping crafting materials into every single barrel before sitting back and watching everything working in harmony. Unfortunately, again, not everything can be perfect, and this is when I discovered a second bug involving the placards yet again. The issue here was that a press wouldn't actually press through a placard, but only when pressing on a depot, since the basin press going through a placard still worked. This made absolutely no sense to me since A, it worked fine with a basin but not a depot, and B, presses can press through blocks anyway. So yeah, I had to remove the placards from the press and depot combos for iron sheets after losing my mind for a bit. And if I'm being honest, I'm still losing my mind over it because I just don't get it. Can you hear it? Can you hear me losing my mind? Do you guys think it's funny that I'm losing my mind? It's still bothering me. There are no placards on it. Even after day 600, I just didn't fix it because the bug needs to go away. And I think about it, it haunts me. After that slight adjustment to the assemblies though, they all seem to be working well. So I gathered up some blocks to finally put the display board to use. I dug behind the board into the wall and set up some water wheels to power it. While I was working, I noticed my internet must have gone out or something because I no longer had my super cool fancy skin on, but I kept trucking anyway because internet is for chumps who don't play single player Minecraft. Imagine having friends to play Minecraft with, right guys? Right? My god, this video is sounding like my slow descent into madness. By day 1000, we're just not even gonna be here anymore. But back on track, once the display board was powered, it was time to get some info on it. So I had to figure out which of the items I wanted to display, and I put stockpile switches down next to each of their barrels. At the time, I didn't actually know the board was the perfect size to display all 10 items, but eventually I'd figure it out. It's just a little bit slower than I'm proud to admit. I dug behind the cogwheel output barrel and put down the stockpile switch along with the display link to transmit the info to the board. I was really surprised to see the option coming from the stockpile switch were pretty lame and not what I wanted, so I guess that maybe the content observer would do a better job and went to craft some. I replaced the stockpile switch with a content observer, set the filter to cogwheels, and thankfully it gave me the information I wanted. I ended up putting a label on it for cogwheels so I would know quickly what the number was actually displaying, and then covered the wall back up. To finish off the day, I went and crafted plenty more content observers so I could set up the rest of the display links. Over the next 2 days, I repeated the same process for every single barrel in the assembly room. I'll admit, some of the barrels were a bit more annoying to work around since I had to break a lot of the beautiful room that I had decorated and place everything back down when I was done, but in the end, all the barrels were being read for the display board. I took a step back, and honestly, I think the display board really ties the whole room together, even though it's not a huge thing. I especially think for some reason, like the white text on the display board is really nice looking in the room. One thing I could say for sure that didn't tie the room together though, was the torches. I decided I would take yet another suggestion from you all and use moss carpets over torches to light the room without having to see them. I spent some time using the moss carpet and torch trick on the central part of the floor, and once it was done, I liked it so much I ended up using it inside all the assembly rooms too. Along with adding in the moss carpets and torches, I also placed more lanterns around the room for a bit more light and just some additional decorations and color as well. I kept thinking that I couldn't like the room more, but all these little details and additions really just kept bringing it to life more and more for me, and it made me want to keep adding in even more stuff. With that goal in mind, I spent the next day crafting and collecting everything I would need to make a train over to the village. I managed to snag a cart assembler and some linear chassis from the chest, but had to craft a minecart, furnace, and then obviously a furnace minecart. I made a plow and a few chests before grabbing super glue, charcoal, and plenty of stone from the storage room. I loaded the train track assembly up with fresh nuggets and andesite and let it run for a little bit before taking all the train tracks from the output chest. Finally, I grabbed some deployers from the new assembly line and was ready to go. I took the elevator to the surface and went up to the minecart platform to assemble the train track placing cart machine thingy. I put down the cart assembler on the already completed rail system and put down a bunch of linear chassis in front of it. I made the linear chassis sticky and put mechanical drills on them so they could mine the blocks needed to properly lay down the train tracks and have a train travel back home eventually. I put some chests down on top of the linear chassis to hold the building blocks and train tracks, and then built out the linear chassis in the back. I put the plow a few blocks back to collect the rails after the cart went over them, and spent a long time messing around with 3 deployers to place down the train tracks themselves and the 2 adjacent blocks that the drills up front would have mined up. Eventually, after enough fiddling, the contraption was ready to go, so I slapped down a lever and fueled up the furnace minecart. It definitely had a bit of a bumpy start for some reason, but once it got going, it really got going. The old rails were being collected and the new train tracks were going in their place on a 3-wide stone path. I hitched a ride on the seat on top and sat back for the next 2 days, while the slow but extremely convenient contraption did its thing. Unfortunately, towards the end of day 570, the contraption ran out of train tracks, so I had to run all the way back to the base, take the elevator down, and just sit at the train track assembly as it made more. The next day was pretty darn boring as the train track assembly was a lot slower than I remember. While I waited for it to produce a sufficient amount of tracks, I grabbed some useful train blocks for my storage, including train stations and train casing. When I came back over to the train assembly, I loaded the system back up with even more andesite and made a second trip to grab more iron nuggets as well. It took a bit of time to convert the iron that I had grabbed in ingot form into nuggets with my limited inventory space, but I was gonna have to sit and wait for a while for the tracks anyway, so I guess I really didn't mind in the end. By the end of the day, I was able to get 5 stacks of train tracks and figured that would be sufficient. Otherwise, I'd be making quite a shameful second trip home. With my inventory full of all the required blocks, I took the elevator back to the surface and ran back down the track to where the contraption had stopped. I placed the cart assembler and contraption back down, loaded it up with blocks again, and made some quick repairs to the tracks behind it that got messed up before I realized it was empty. Once everything was fixed, I loaded the rest of the blocks into the contraption, fueled it up again, and hopped on the seat. I managed to make it an entire day before I ran out of train tracks again. As the sun rose, I made the walk of shame back to the base to yet again sit and wait for the train tracks to be crafted. Based off the minimap, I had gotten so close, but close wasn't good enough, so yeah. Suffice to say, train tracks have been a bit of a rough spot for me during this series so far. After I took the elevator back down into the base, I grabbed some stone and then just sat and watched the train track assembly run for the entire day since I quite literally had nothing else I needed to do. As the next day started, I began the now all too familiar journey of running down the train tracks with an inventory full of what should hopefully be enough resources to finish off the train tracks. Once I made it to where the contraption left off, I decided to just manually complete the remaining portion since I was within sight of the village. I had to do some manual clearing of blocks to be able to finish it up, but the ability to mass place train tracks with the blocks underneath them made it super quick to finish. I made sure to leave ample room in front of the train track and cleared out some additional space to the side of it to make a loop for the train to eventually turn around. The loop itself was a bit of a pain to make since there were so many trees in the way, but I managed to get about 75% of it done before the sun set for the day. Bright and early the next morning, I finished off the loop at the village and cleared out all the trees that would be blocking the train's path. I expanded the stone platform a bit and put down a train station right before the loop started so I could both assemble a train and eventually pull them in here to transport villagers back and forth. I clicked to assemble a new train and put down 2 bogies before taking a quick break to clear out some of the partially remaining trees over the train track that were really bothering me. Once the trees were cleared out, I made the most boring train ever just using some stone blocks, a few white seats, and train controls. It was quite literally the bare minimum possible to even make a train, but should work just fine for transporting villagers. I assembled the train and rode it all the way back to the base, where I set up an identical loop with another train station at the start. I was so excited to finally have this done that I rode the train around and around until the sun went down, and during that I accidentally killed a pig or two in the process. Unfortunately, the fun had to end as I took the elevator back into the base to prep for moving the villagers. I crafted a bunch of minecarts and grabbed a boat to help with moving them before making my way back to the surface. I rode the train all the way back to the village, which was a lot faster and more fun than running, and ran around seeing if a villager could even be forced onto a seat. I eventually figured out they could in fact be put on a seat, so I made a pathway up to the seats on the second bogie of the train to bring the villagers up. I imagined the villagers would be pretty difficult to just get up the pathway on their own, so I ran some rails up the blocks to the seats from a small box that I planned to just trap the villagers in. One by one, I collected the villagers in a boat and brought them to the box, where I then loaded them into a minecart and shoved them up onto the train. Turns out the train has to be disassembled for them to properly sit down, but they do stay seated once it's reassembled. Once all 3 villagers were on their seats in the train, I cleaned everything up and reassembled the train before catching a quick nap. I hopped on the train and took all 3 villagers back to the base, and as it turns out, it was a lot more pleasant than the last time that I tried to use a random minecart contraption to take them back. I took the elevator down into the base to quickly grab some extra train tracks before coming up to the surface and clearing out the remaining minecart rails leading from the train to the elevator. I used the new train tracks that I had just picked up to run tracks down closer to the elevator and made yet another loop so I'd have an even easier place to unload the villagers. Once the loop was finished, I knew I was going to need another train station if I wanted to properly set everything up, and I didn't seem to have any stations or sturdy sheets to craft them in my chest, so I went to the lava generator to make some obsidian. I mined 4 pieces of obsidian before cleaning everything up and dumping it in the ore processing setup. Yet again, and maybe it's just me, but I got extremely unlucky and only 1 piece of obsidian survived 1 single round of processing when, as far as I'm aware, it's meant to be a 75% chance it survives. But either way, I got 5 powdered obsidian, which should be enough. I put the powdered obsidian on the lava spout depot and then put the unprocessed sheets on the press in the mixing area to finally be turned into sturdy sheets. I used the sturdy sheets to make train casing and crafted the train station I needed. It was already nighttime, but I wanted to finish moving the villagers as soon as possible, so I went to the surface, put down the train station, and pulled the train into the new area. Now that the villagers were finally at the base, I wanted to avoid making the trip again if at all possible, even though I had just made a really nice train there, so I gathered up everything I'd need to make a very basic villager breeder. I had quite literally never built one before, so I just hoped the video tutorial I watched still worked and filled up my inventory with beds, glass, trapdoors, and some random building blocks. While I was down in the base, I also cleaned up my inventory a bit, did some trading, and compressed some iron and gold to avoid the chests from overflowing. After I made my way back to the surface, I tore down the old dirt box that I kept my villagers in and cleared out a bit more room nearby and started assembling the villager breeder. I'm not going to rehash the tutorial for you all and just bore you, plus it's pretty simple if you do want to copy it, so you could probably get all of it from this video, but let's just say building it was probably the easiest part of this entire ordeal. The only thing missing from the villager breeder was actual villagers, so I encased the second bogie in stone and then disassembled the train before moving 2 villagers by boat into the breeding area. I tossed some bread in for them, and nothing happened. I even turned particle effects on to see if I was missing something and kept throwing in more bread, but nothing seemed to work. After waiting a whole day and having literally nothing happen, I broke and replaced all the beds for like the bazillionth time, and then I randomly tried putting down a stone cutter inside the breeding chamber, which ended up making them breed almost instantly. I have no clue why this worked, but it did, so I was just super happy. Once they finished breeding, I took the stone cutter out, and while I waited to see if the villager breeder would continue working, I took the last villager off the train and over to the elevator. I managed to get them down into the base pretty easily and just stuck them in a boat at the bottom of the elevator to wait until I had the rest of the villagers down there with them. Over the next 2 days, I sat and waited for the villagers to breed more. While I was waiting, I did get to see them breed one more time, so I had 2 baby villagers down in the water stream waiting to grow up. Feeling pretty confident the system was now working on its own, I went on a small adventure to try and find more cows to kill for leather, but after running around for nearly an entire day, I found almost no cows. Apparently, I had completely decimated the cow population around my base, which is going to be a bit of a problem with how many item frames and placards I seem to be using in this series now. When I came back to the villager breeder, I did a quick check and I saw that I had 3 baby villagers now, all waiting to grow up, which was perfect because I needed 3 more for down in the base. Since I didn't just want to sit and wait for the baby villagers to all grow up, I went back down into the base and started expanding the entrance into the assembly room. After just a bit of mining, I noticed I wasn't picking anything up, so I took a fairly long break to clear out all the random junk from my inventory. Once my inventory was back in working order, I continued to expand the entrance with the goal of having 4 villagers that would be there for trading. I wanted to make sure the area looked nice and could fit all the villagers properly before bringing them down, so I grabbed a bunch of the same decorative blocks I used for the assembly room and started designing the trading area. It took a lot of trial and error, and I definitely went for a similar style as my other villager trading area, which is why I had to keep running over there to look at it to figure out how past Rage even designed it. I figured it was probably going to be a little bit cramped for the villagers, but it would actually probably be thematically correct for a hidden underground area. After finishing the general design for the trading area, I crafted 2 stone cutters and 2 smithing tables so I could trade stone to the masons and iron to the toolsmiths. I used deep slate to make a super wonky path from the elevator over to the trading area, really just so I could easily take the villagers over in a boat and didn't have to worry about the levels of the ground changing and the boat not actually working. I took the elevator to the surface and had a bit of a bittersweet moment since I was happy to see the villagers grown up, but I had no idea what happened to my 2 original breeding villagers. I trapped the first villager in a boat and took them down the elevator, but they started causing some problems running around the base, so I immediately took them over to the new trading area and just trapped them in. I brought the second villager I already had downstairs over right after and trapped them in using a stone cutter as well. I went back to the surface yet again to get the next villager, and they really put up a struggle. For some reason, they didn't want to get in the elevator, but eventually I forced them in after a few minutes of intense battle. We took a very nice, peaceful ride down, and I trapped them in a boat before going back to get the final villager. Turns out, I actually had no villager left, since both my original villagers and now one of my baby villagers had just disappeared. So I stole all the beds from the breeder and went back to the assembly room to make a makeshift breeder inside the base. I spent the entire next day assembling quite possibly the most disgusting and awful makeshift villager breeder in all of Minecraft. I basically just released the villagers into a small area and slapped down as many beds as possible nearby with a single trap door in hopes they would get it on and let my nightmare be over. I tore a lot of stuff up and placed it back down over the course of the day, but amazingly, right at the end of the day, the villagers bred and made a baby. The process of getting both adult villagers back into their chambers was arguably more painful and shameful than the prior day's attempt to assemble a villager breeder. There was pushing and shoving and maybe even some name calling, but I did manage to get both of them back in their chambers and block them in with stone cutters again before clearing out all the random junk blocks I used to make a breeder. I tried to catch the baby villager in a boat, but somehow they got caught in the belt system first, and right as I was about to disconnect it, they just wandered into the boat. I figured I'd just leave them in the boat to grow up, and while I waited for that, I brought the final villager over from the elevator and forced them into their chamber. If you can imagine, this one was even more painful than the other ones, and I even tried to use water to force them into a single block. While I was working, I noticed they were already a mason for some reason, so I broke the stone cutters in front of the other villagers and the one over by my bed, but it didn't change anything. I did finally get the villager trapped, but because I couldn't figure out why they were still a mason, I let them out in hopes of finding their workstation. They started pathing around and randomly lost the mason job right before running to the enchanting area to become a weaponsmith. I broke the grindstone and trapped them in a boat and finally got them into their chamber with the proper job. The next day I had to repeat a relatively similar process with the now grown-up villager that I had trapped in the boat in the assembly room. Since they would have to go upstairs to get to their chamber, I ended up having to corral them and slowly inch them towards their area. I'm not gonna lie guys, it was a painstaking process waiting for them to just wander forward randomly, but in the end, they made their way to the chamber and I was able to trap them in with a smithing table. I figured it might be nice to spruce up the area a bit more since the villagers were all stuck in such a small space, so I put some patches of moss in the ceiling and grew a few vines of glowberries from them. I also put down some chains hanging from the ceiling and put lanterns hanging off a few of those. I put just a tiny bit of moss carpet on the floor of the hallway and was super happy with how everything had come together. I spent the rest of the day trading with all the villagers to repair my tools, which surprisingly took a long amount of time now that I had 5 different villagers to trade with. The only thing left to do to finish off the room completely was to make an awesome entrance, so I crafted up a bunch of piston extension poles and mechanical pistons. Luckily, I was able to grab some redstone links from my chest, and the only other thing I needed to craft was a single gear shift. While I was crafting, I noticed no clay was flowing into my storage system, which was odd because I had just put a bunch into the ore processing to go from blocks into normal clay for trading, so I checked on the vault and it turns out it was never connected to the belt system. I hooked it up and in came a massive influx of clay and other random secondary outputs from the ore processing. While that huge backlog of items was unloading, I went over to the assembly room entrance and used deep slate and moss to map out how I wanted the entrance to look once it was closed. I got it decently blended in with the surroundings and then dug out the area below it that would be the staircase to make room for the mechanical pistons. Once I got deep enough to place the pistons and their extension poles, I put all the mechanical pistons down and rotated them to face up. After placing all of them, I took a quick look and decided the pistons would probably need a bit more room for the extension poles and just cleared out some extra space below them as well. I started putting down piston extension poles at different lengths based on how high up I wanted the stopped position to be. This was my clever method of only using a single gear shift for every mechanical piston, since using a sequenced gear shift for every piston individually wouldn't even work. In this setup, the extension poles are a critical limiter to the full extension length of the piston, so I can just mindlessly power all of them and only worry about flipping the rotational direction when I want to open or close the door. The extension poles took a bit of time to finish off, and then I made a quick water wheel setup next to the pistons with only a gear shift and lever just to do some testing. The first run showed everything was one short, so I extended each pole by one and also made each piston sticky. The second trial run definitely went better and the pistons grabbed each block, but when they came down, I immediately noticed the problem with my setup since it was all at one level instead of in a staircase shape. I tore down nearly all the pistons and reassembled them in a staircase pattern, so as they lowered, it would form a proper staircase to walk down into the assembly room. This process took a while as the pole length had to then vary depending on which stair level it was as well as the final height of the block. After getting everything set up again, I tried it out and took a bit longer than I'd like to admit to realize the redstone was wrong, so I used a toggle lever with the link to maintain the power state of the gear shift. One final trial showed I had the pole lengths wrong again, so I adjusted them one by one, checking each time if it was the correct height. Finally, I got it working properly and it looked awesome. It was definitely the perfect way to finish off my biggest build yet. And with that, it was day 600. Another 100 days were in the book, and this time I managed to tackle my biggest project yet and complete the challenge that I set for myself. Let me know in the comments what you guys thought of the build and if you want to see 700 days next. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe if you guys did enjoy the video.